Hey guys, it's Caitlin and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be doing part 2 in my series on planning a novel, which was a request, and I decided that instead of just doing one super long video, I would break it up into many different steps that are super useful to go over when talking about planning a novel. So last week I did a video all about plotting versus pantsing, which you can see up here, and I will also link down below in the description box if you want to go check out part 1. I talked all about the 3 different types of writers, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of each type, and some things to consider going into planning your novel once you decide what type that you are. I just think that it's really beneficial to know what kind of a writer you are and what kind of style that you often adopt. And I wasn't 100% confident about starting the series there because I knew that a lot of you probably already know the difference between plotting and pantsing, and maybe I was just giving you information you already know, but some of you actually said it was really helpful, so I'm really glad that that video was helpful. And again, if you want to check it out, I will leave it down below in the description box. Like I said, today is part 2, and we are going to be talking about what to do right after you have an idea for a brand new book. This is really where the advice that was requested on Twitter stems from, because the person who asked me says that she has an idea for a novel, her first novel, that she wants to write, and all she has is the idea, but she doesn't know what to do now. She doesn't know how to go about planning and plotting and getting into drafting. So today we're going to start getting into more of the meat of the series, and then in the next video, which is part 3, we're going to be talking about outlining strategies, and I'm going to be getting really technical with you guys and sharing 3 or possibly 4 different outlining strategies and how to go into really plotting your book and hitting all of those high points and plot points you want to be hitting, which is climax, resolution, all of that kind of stuff, which we will be talking about in the next video, which should be up sometime later this week, so stay tuned for that. But before we get to outlining strategies, I think that there's a step between idea and outlining strategies. Before you get more technical and start using resources or methods for outlining, I like to do something first, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And basically, we're going to be going all the way back to elementary school and using the who, what, when, where, and why method to really flesh out our idea and start thinking of a plot for the book before we actually put that plot into a structured outline. The reason that I want to start here is because before you get into the technical details of planning your book and outlining it point by point and building that really meaty skeleton, you want to start off with a frame that you can build on. And that frame, I often like to use the who, what, when, where, why. And normally I don't sit down and use like a chart like you would in elementary school, like you used to do in school if you remember way back then. I don't actually sit down and use something like that, but I kind of follow this method and just ask myself these questions when planning a new book, and it really helps me to build layers on the story. We're going to be talking a lot about layers and how you can just build like rings onto your idea and build characters, plot, conflict, what they are looking for, what they're driven for, and yeah, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I don't have any structured method. Again, we're just going to use the who, what, when, where, why, and we're going to start asking some questions about our idea, really thinking. This is more just like the thought and brainstorming process before we get to the actual outlining process. Which, if you also remember way back to elementary school, when you do the different steps of writing a story, you actually start with brainstorming before you get to outlining. So this is that brainstorming piece before we get to the technical bits. So in my next video all about outlining, in part 3, we're going to be talking about some strategies, like I said, and one of those strategies is the 8-point arc, or I think that's what it's called, the 8-point story arc or the 8-point arc, and I got this off of the website Daily Writing Tips, and again, I'm going to be going into detail and showing you how it works in the next video. But the reason that I mention it here is because an interesting thing that I found in that article was that the author who created the 8-point story arc and who uses it for her own books does not use it to plan. She actually just uses it to outline. So when she's brainstorming and just planning, starting with an idea and doing the initial stage, she doesn't use the 8-point story arc. She leaves that until later. And that's because she wants to have more freedom to just think about the book creatively without trying to fit it into a technical method and a technical outline. She just wants to have the freedom and the creativity to just start playing around with the characters, playing around with the story, and exploring it before she gets technical. And that's what we're going to be talking about today as we use the who, what, when, where, and why. We just want to get a little bit creative and just start delving into the story, exploring it, and trying to figure out who are our characters, what do they want, where do they live, what's the world like, and what is going to happen that causes a problem for them that ultimately jumpstarts the story, causes the conflict, and gives them a reason in the story, a desire, what they want, and what they're moving towards. So I personally, for my last 3 books that I've written, didn't use any kind of outlining strategy or anything like that. I just kind of jumped into the book, which again, I talked about in my first video, plotting versus pantsing, and I also talked a little bit about my process for my last 3 books and my process for my 4th book, which I'm currently planning right now, and it's the 2nd book in my series, which comes out on August 29th, What Lies Above. I'm currently writing the sequel to What Lies Above, and my process is completely different this time around. I'm much more structured, much more of a plotter, because I'm on deadline and I have to be in order to get this story done in that amount of time. I need more structure and I need more of a plan. Plus, when you're writing a series, you have more like guidelines, I guess you could say, because you're starting certain plot points in book 1 that you need to continue in book 2, either finish or continue on to book 3, and then I'm starting new plot points and new character arcs in book 2 that need to carry over to book 3. So there's a lot of plot threads happening all at once, and I need to keep track of all of them. So if I tried to pants this novel, it would probably be a train wreck. So instead, I'm just using a really structured plan in order to make sure that I'm tying up the plot arcs that need to be tied up, starting the ones that need to be started, and continuing the ones that need to be continued. Alright, so now let's get into the heart of the video. Without worrying about all of the technical outlining strategies, which we'll talk about in the next video, here is how I start planning a book whenever I just have the idea. I only have the initial idea, I don't have anything else. This is what I do immediately after that to start building the story. Like I said, we're going to use the who, what, when, where, and why questions to kind of start building layers on our story. And in order to illustrate how this works, I'm going to use the Hunger Games, because I'm sure that most of you probably have read the Hunger Games or seen the movie and know the plot of the first book. So hopefully this will not be too spoilery for you guys, because I didn't want to use a book that maybe some of you haven't read, because in order to use this method, I do kind of have to use some spoilers. So maybe if you haven't seen the Hunger Games or you don't know what happens in it, I'm not going to be telling you every detail. I'm just going to be telling you the general plot. So if you don't know anything about the Hunger Games, maybe you'd want to skip this part, but if you have read it or seen the movies or know pretty much anything about it, this won't be too spoilery. I don't know why I can't say that. Spoilery for you guys. I'm just using it as a gauge and as an like a general outline to set on this frame of who, what, when, where, why, to kind of show you how it works. Okay, so starting with the initial idea, if you will. The initial idea, or the general idea of the Hunger Games, is that there is a televised battle to the death among teenagers, and there is one winner. They have to kill everyone off, and the one winner survives and gets showered with money and prizes and is allowed to live. And basically the way that it's determined is by drawing their names randomly out of a bowl at the what's it called in the Hunger Games? At the reaping. Okay, so that's a general idea. Televised battle to the death among teenagers. Names are drawn randomly via a lottery at the reaping. Alright, so now we have an idea, but we have no characters and we have no plot. So we're going to ask the next question, which is who? Who is this story going to focus on? Who is the story going to be about? Who is your main character? Obviously, most of you probably know the main character is Katniss Everdeen, but a name is not going to get us very far. We have to start building on that. Not only do we need to know who is it about, but we need to know something about her. So what are some things that you could say about Katniss Everdeen? Well, she's a hunter, which is super important to the story. She and her best friend Gale hunt, so that's where the story actually opens up, because it's so critical to her character development and to the story overall. So you could say that's something about her. She lives in District 12, she has a sister named Prim. Like, you just start building things, character aspects and character traits, but also things about the world that are relevant to the character, their personality. You're basically just building their personality and the world around them that's specific to that character. Alright, so then we might ask, why is the Hunger Games even a critical part of the world? Why is it important? And how did it get started? So if you've read the book or you've seen the movie, you know that there was an uprising against the Capitol among the districts, and in order to punish the districts for the uprising, the Hunger Games was started, where one boy and one girl from each district have to compete in the Hunger Games and either kill everyone else off or kill enough people off to survive, or they themselves will die. Okay, so then you could ask another who question. Who started the games? Like I said, it's the Capitol, but specifically in the Hunger Games, the real villain is President Snow, who is in charge of the Capitol and who specifically goes after Katniss with the vengeance, because we're not going to get into those spoilers, but because of everything that happens not only in the first book, but the rest of the series. So now we have a villain emerging, which is President Snow. So we have the Capitol, which in general is seen as like evil, even though all the people that live in the capital aren't necessarily evil. The capital itself is like this shining pinnacle in the world where everyone is wealthy, everyone is rich, and people don't have to compete in the Hunger Games. But all of the districts, who are often poorer, and there's different degrees of poverty in the districts, but in general they're more poor than the capital, and their children are put into the reaping to compete in the Hunger Games. So we have a overall villain, the capital, and then specifically we have President Snow, who is the true villain in the story. Now, as we start adding more and more characters, we have Katniss and we have President Snow, and then I also mentioned Gale, which is Katniss's best friend. As we start adding all of these characters, oh, and I mentioned Prim, her sister as well, we can start building character profiles, which I will talk about in video 4 in this series. So again, stick around and stay tuned for the rest of the videos if you're interested in how to fully plan a novel. Again, video 3, next time I'll be talking about outlining strategies, and in video 4 I'll be talking about character profiles. Alright, and then this is probably the most spoilery thing that I'm going to say in the video, so if you don't want to hear it, then you might just want to skip ahead a little bit. But now we can ask what happens to Katniss that really propels her into the heart of the story, that gives her something to fight for or a problem to overcome. What's the conflict? And this is the heart of the story, which is that her sister Prim's name is pulled out of the bowl at the reaping to compete in the Hunger Games. Prim is only 12 years old, and she's the main character's little sister, who is the most important person to her in the entire world. And so this causes a huge issue for our main character because she knows that more than likely her sister is going to die. So then if you were writing this story from scratch, you now have the main character and you have a conflict and you have most of the world, or at least a good framework of the world. You have the Hunger Games and you know what this conflict is. So then you would ask yourself, how is the character going to resolve this? And most of you probably also know this, Katniss Everdeen volunteers as tribute to go into the Hunger Games in place of her sister. And this causes the unfolding of the rest of the story. So I had to go and get something, which I'm going to show you guys in a second. So sorry for popping out and then popping back in, but I wanted to show you guys something as part of what we're going to talk about next. But going back to the who, what, when, where, why, I don't want to continue because I could go on and on and on using those questions to talk about more elements of the Hunger Games, or in general when you're building your book. You can go on and on using those questions to build layer after layer after layer onto your story, to add depth not only to your main character but to your secondary characters as well, because you want their character arcs to be really well developed. You don't want them to just be flat and just like plot points. You want them to be actual people, and you want them to have depth and character as well. You can use those questions to build on your story, and I know that it might seem like amateur to use the who, what, when, where, why strategy to help plan your novel, but personally, I found that it's super helpful to add those layers to the story so that then when you go into the outlining strategies, you can have all of this information to pull from and to fit now into those main plot points that most stories follow. Like I said, we'll talk a lot more about outlining in the next video, so for now I'm not going to get into that anymore. But again, this part of the process where you're just building on your idea is less about getting it right and just more about building it and getting it down, starting to explore your world and figure out, who am I telling the story about, what does he or she want, and what's going to happen that causes a problem for them that they then have to solve or overcome. Which, as you guys know, is the perfect crux for any book. That's pretty much how every book follows. Character, problem, how are they going to solve the problem? Alright, so now we're going to talk about how you can go about doing this. There's two ways, paper and using a computer, and that's what I wanted to go and get. This is a notebook that I actually used to plot my third novel, which is my YA fantasy novel, and I'm actually still kind of writing it because I wrote about 60,000 words, so I still need to write probably about 30,000 or 40,000 because most of my books are about 100,000 words, which I know sounds like a lot to many of you. It's about 400 pages, but on average, I write books that are about 100,000 words, so I guess you're getting your money's worth whenever you buy any of my books because they are quite lengthy. Anywho, this is the notebook that I used to plan part of my YA fantasy work in progress, and I actually started off using paper planning and just writing all of my ideas and thoughts down, and I will show you the inside. I'm not going to get too close because I don't want you guys to see because there are some spoilers, but here's the first page. As you can see, there's a lot on there. This is mainly character names, and you can see I've circled and drawn arrows, and also that is not the title if you can see that. I have a different title that's not on here, so that's not a spoiler. But you can see I've circled things, drawn arrows, underlined stuff, bolded things, and wrote notes in the margins. This is because whenever I started off, I needed to make a family tree because who is related to who is really important in this book. So in order to do that, I just wrote everybody down and started connecting them and figuring out who was actually related to everybody, because I got very confused about who was actually related and who was not. So in order to help myself, it was easier to write that down on paper than to do it on a computer. In general, I do the majority of my planning on a computer, just in a Word document, and I'll talk about the pros and cons of each way in a second. Not as in-depth as I did in my first video, by the way, just like mentioning a few things, but I found that it can be really helpful to write stuff down in an actual notebook if you need to do more like movement and connecting things visually, like lines, circles, writing in the margins, things like that, initially, because you can just put everything down, scratch things out, make notes, and it kind of helps get my thoughts organized. So you can see I did character list and family tree. I also did a map that I drew myself so that I would keep track of where everyone was going, because they move around a bit. A pronunciation guide for my names, because the names are have very interesting spellings and they have accents and different things on them as well. And then this is also another map, which you might not be able to see because it's in pencil. So yeah, I had just done a few things in a notebook to help me. I know that some writers really prefer to do everything in a notebook, and if you follow me on Instagram, you saw that I just posted a photo, which by the time this video goes up is a few days old, where I had a photo of my computer and there was a notebook in front of it, and I had written out handwritten notes in it. And I'm also using handwritten notes and notebooks to plan right now what lies above book 2, and it's really helpful for me. But I also have pages and pages and pages in a Word document of plot points that are several paragraphs long and I've typed out. So the benefit of using a computer is that you can type out long paragraphs, and you can also copy and paste or move things around very easily. Whereas in a notebook, you obviously cannot just pick up the text and move it to another part. You'll either have to rewrite it or literally cut it out and paste it somewhere else. So that's a downfall of using paper, but I think that it can be helpful to get your thoughts sorted and organized. And like I said, family trees, maps, stuff like that can be really beneficial to write down on paper as well. Ultimately, pick what works for you, because writing is a very personal process and you have to figure out what the best process is for you and for your book. So play around with it, do some in paper, do some online, figure out your process and figure out what works best for you. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to talk about before I wrap all of this up is series, because there's something I want to point out, and I'm going to do a whole video on planning a series later because there's some specific things I want to talk about. But one thing that I really want to mention is that if you are planning, or you know that your book is going to lead into a series, whether it's a duology, a trilogy, or a full series, which by the way, duology is 2 books, trilogy is 3 books, and series is 4 books or more. If you know that your book is not going to be a standalone, there are some things that you want to consider when you are planning, because they're going to carry over across the whole series. Now, the reason that I say it's so important to not just focus on the first book is because you're going to have plot points, which I mentioned that I did earlier in the video. You're going to have plot points that start in book 1 and finish in book 2, start in book 1 and finish in book 3, so you have to continue them through the whole series, or finish in book 6 or 7, however many books you have. Then you might have plot points that start in book 2 or book 3 and they continue on. And so all of your plot points will start and end or continue at different points in the story, and if you don't keep track of them, you might lose them, and then you'll have plot holes. Plot threads that are unfinished turn into plot holes. So you don't want that to happen. You want all of your plot threads to be resolved, or at least answered in some way, so the reader's not left hanging. And in order to do that, you need to keep track of all of them. So if you are planning a series, it's good to go ahead and start thinking about the overall arc of the story and not just the arc in book 1. Because when you're writing a series, even if it's only 2 books, you're going to have an overall arc for the story where it begins in book 1 and it is resolved in book 3, but then you're also going to have it broken down into individual arcs in each book. So for example, Hunger Games, let's go back to Hunger Games. In the overall story arc, obviously Katniss's goal and the characters in the book are trying to overthrow the corrupt government. That doesn't just happen in book 1 though. Book 1's main goal for Katniss is to protect her sister and to survive in the Hunger Games when she goes in. So that's her individual arc, but then the overarching arc is to overthrow the government and to be free and to ultimately end the Hunger Games. So that all doesn't happen in one book, so knowing up front what the overall arc is of your story will be helpful, because then you can start breaking it down book by book. And this is also super important, is that once you have written book 1, and it's not published, and you start writing, let's say that for me, for example, I'm writing book 2 right now of What Lies Above. So book 1, even though it has a release date and it's coming out on August 29th, it's not published yet. So I could technically change things still in book 1 if I thought of a new idea in book 2. Once book 1 is published on August 29th and out in the world, I cannot go back and change things. So I give you the advice that if you are writing a series and you know that you are wanting to publish, that it's very wise to go on ahead and start thinking about the series as a whole, so that you know, hey, if I want to resolve this in book 3, or I ultimately want this to happen in book 3, that perhaps I can start it in book 1 or book 2. Let's say there's a huge reveal or a huge plot twist. You want to start building to that and foreshadowing a little bit in books 1 and book 2 if it's going to be, let's say, revealed in book 3. But if you don't know that because you haven't thought about book 2 or 3 at all, you've only thought about book 1, then you might ultimately end up publishing book 1, thinking of it later, and then not being able to go back and start that big reveal and big foreshadowing leading up to that reveal in book 2 and 3. I know that was a lot of words and a lot of confusing things. So basically, just thinking about the series as a whole can help you to know what to start and finish and plan for each book, and knowing where the story as a whole is going. Because even though each book should have somewhat of its own arc, whether or not you leave on a cliffhanger or you leave it resolved at the end of the book, every book kind of has its own arc. You ultimately want those arcs to fit into a bigger overarching arc for the whole series. Alright, so that is all for today's video. Like I said, writing is messy. Do not be afraid of the process, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. You can always go back and fix it in revisions. Sorry about my dog barking in the background. If you guys have been watching my channel for a while, you know that's just normal, so ignore that. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful. Please let me know down below in the comments, are you writing a book? Are you planning a book? What is your work in progress like? I would love to connect with you guys. Leave me a comment down below. Like and subscribe if you want to get updates about the part 3 and part 4 in this video series, and then also any of my future videos as well. And all of my social media is linked down below in the description box, as well as the link to video 1 about plotting and pantsing. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye!